In the Appalachian wilderness, Jack, a veteran, discovers Shadow, a malnourished military dog tied to a tree. Shadow's tag leads Jack to Luke, a former comrade battling PTSD in isolation. Jack and Shadow embark on a mission to find Luke, uncovering his struggle with guilt and trauma. Through their bond and unwavering support, Luke begins a journey of healing at a VA center, with Shadow playing a crucial role as a therapy dog. Over time, Luke transforms his pain into purpose, helping other veterans through his work with service animals. The story is a moving testament to loyalty, resilience, and the courage it takes to seek help. What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe to DG Story for more heartfelt tales like this one. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. The chill of an Appalachian winter morning hung in the air as Jack adjusted his scarf and tightened the straps of his backpack. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint golden light through the dense canopy of pine and oak trees. The crunch of frosty leaves under his boots was the only sound accompanying him as he made his way deeper into the forest. Jack had been walking this trail for years, finding solace in its quiet embrace. A former sniper in the U.S. Army, he now lived a solitary life, working as a mechanic in a small town nearby. The woods were his escape, a place where the memories of desert battles and the deafening roar of gunfire couldn't reach him. As he moved further into the forest, something caught his attention, a faint, high-pitched whine carried on the breeze. He stopped abruptly, scanning the area with the precision of someone who had spent years surviving in hostile environments. The sound came again, a desperate whimper that seemed out of place in the stillness. "Hello," Jack called out, his voice cautious but firm. He didn't expect an answer, but the habit of staying alert never left him. The whimper grew louder as he approached a large pine tree that stood like a sentinel in the clearing ahead. His breath caught in his throat when he saw it. A dog, a malinois, he recognized, was tied tightly to the base of the tree with a piece of frayed rope. His coat, once sleek and golden, was matted with mud, and its ribs jutted out beneath its thin fur. The dog's dark eyes, filled with exhaustion and desperation, locked onto Jack's. Despite its condition, there was an air of discipline about the animal, as if it had been trained to endure. Jack knelt down slowly, setting his rifle aside. "Easy there, buddy," he said softly, extending his hand. The dog didn't growl or snap, but its ears perked slightly at the sound of Jack's voice. As he edged closer, he noticed something metallic glinting around its neck. A tag. He reached out cautiously, his fingers trembling slightly as he brushed away the mud obscuring the tag's surface. What he read made his stomach drop. "Morgan." "Luke." "Luke," Jack whispered, the name stirring a flood of memories he had tried to bury. Luke Morgan was more than just a friend. He was a brother in arms, a man who had saved Jack's life more than once in the heat of battle. But they had lost touch after leaving the service, each retreating into their own worlds of silence and pain. Jack looked back at the dog, who now watched him intently, as if recognizing the shift in his demeanor. "Shadow?" he asked, testing the name. The dog's tail gave a faint wag, and Jack's chest tightened. Shadow was Luke's partner during their deployment, a highly trained military working dog who had once sniffed out explosives and tracked insurgents in the unforgiving deserts of Afghanistan. "How the hell did you end up here?" Jack muttered, his mind racing. He inspected the area around the tree and found footprints in the frozen soil. Someone had been here recently. Cigarette butts littered the ground nearby, and the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. Whoever had tied Shadow to this tree hadn't planned on coming back. Jack quickly retrieved a water bottle from his pack, pouring a small amount into his cupped hand. Shadow lapped it up greedily, his tail wagging slightly faster. Jack couldn't help but smile despite the knot forming in his gut. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" he said, as he worked to untie the rope. Jack's thoughts turned to Luke. The man he remembered was strong, confident, and always the first to crack a joke when things got tough. But the name on the tag and the state of Shadow painted a different picture, one of struggle and abandonment. Shadow stood shakily as Jack finally freed him. Staying close to his side, Jack patted the dog gently, feeling the wiry strength still present beneath the grime. "All right, buddy," he said, his voice steadying. "Let's figure out what happened to Luke." With Shadow at his side, Jack turned back toward the trail, his mind already forming a plan. This was no longer just a morning hunt. It was the start of a mission, one that might lead him to answers, and perhaps a chance to save an old friend before it was too late. Shadow walked alongside Jack, his steps hesitant but deliberate, as if each one brought back memories of his training. Jack glanced down at the dog, noticing how its ears perked at every sound, its nose twitching as it caught scents on the breeze. Even in its weakened state, Shadow's instincts as a military working dog were evident. Back at his small cabin near the edge of the forest, Jack set about tending to Shadow. He filled a bowl with water and placed it on the floor, along with a small portion of venison jerky from his hunting supplies. Shadow sniffed the food cautiously before sitting back, his eyes locked onto Jack. "Permission to eat." "Ha!" Jack muttered. Recognizing the behavior, he crouched down, meeting the dog's gaze. "It's okay, buddy. Go ahead." At his words, Shadow dove into the food, devouring it with the precision of a disciplined soldier. Jack sat back on his heels, his mind racing. Luke's name on Shadow's tag wasn't just a coincidence. He had heard rumors about Luke after they returned from Afghanistan, how he had struggled to adjust to civilian life, how he'd moved to a remote cabin deep in the Appalachians to escape the noise of the world. Jack hadn't seen him in years, and guilt twisted in his chest. He should have kept in touch, but the war had left scars on all of them. Some were just harder to see. After Shadow finished eating, Jack inspected the dog more closely. Beneath the mud and grime, he found a small pocket sewn into Shadow's collar. Inside was a folded piece of paper, worn and creased from handling. Jack carefully unfolded it, revealing a scrawled note. "Shadow knows the way. Find him before it's too late." The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, but it was unmistakably Luke's. Jack's jaw tightened as he read the words again, his mind racing with possibilities. What had happened to Luke? Why had he left Shadow tied to that tree? And what was he running from? He sat in his chair, staring at the note as Shadow lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws. The dog's breathing had steadied, but his eyes remained alert, darting around the room as if scanning for threats. Jack reached down, running his fingers through Shadow's coarse fur. "All right," he said aloud, his voice firm. "If Luke left you out there, it's because he thought you'd lead someone to him. We're gonna figure this out." Jack spent the next hour gathering supplies, a map of the surrounding area, a flashlight, extra food for Shadow, and his old service knife. He laid the map out on the table, marking the location where he'd found Shadow. If Luke was somewhere in these woods, there had to be a trail leading to him. Shadow suddenly stood, his ears twitching. He moved to the door, letting out a low whine. Jack followed his gaze, seeing nothing but the dark outline of trees beyond the window. "You know something I don't?" Jack asked, grabbing his coat and rifle. Shadow wagged his tail slightly, a faint glimmer of the determined dog he must have been. Jack opened the door, letting the cold air rush in. "All right, boy, show me the way." Shadow led him into the forest, his nose to the ground. Jack followed closely, his rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the shadows for signs of movement. The night was quiet, save for the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. They hadn't gone far when Shadow stopped abruptly, his body tensed. Jack crouched beside him, scanning the area with his flashlight. The beam landed on a cluster of cigarette butts scattered near a fallen log. He picked one up, feeling its dry texture. Whoever had been here hadn't left long ago. "Luke!" Jack called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. Only silence replied. Shadow sniffed around the area, then began pulling Jack in a new direction. His movements more urgent. Jack let him lead, his mind racing. If someone had been here recently, they could still be nearby. After another half-mile, they came upon a small campsite. It was hastily abandoned, with a smoldering fire pit and a tarp draped over a makeshift frame. Jack's flashlight illuminated scattered belongings: an empty water bottle, a worn notebook, and a pair of boots. He picked up the notebook, flipping through its pages. Most of it was filled with illegible scrawls, but one phrase stood out, written over and over: "I can't escape the shadows." Jack's grip tightened on the notebook as he read the haunting words. He looked down at Shadow, who sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the boots. A faint growl escaped the dog's throat, and Jack followed his gaze. In the distance, just beyond the reach of his flashlight, a faint rustling sound broke the silence. Jack's heart pounded as he raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Who's there?" he demanded. The rustling stopped. Shadow let out a low bark, his body rigid with focus. Jack held his breath, waiting for any sign of movement. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the forest fell silent once more. Jack lowered his rifle, his pulse still racing. Whatever or whoever had been there was gone now. But the lingering sense of unease told him that this was far from over. "Come on, Shadow," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "Let's keep moving." Shadow barked once in response, his tail wagging slightly as he resumed the trail. Jack followed, clutching the notebook tightly in his hand. He didn't know what they were heading toward, but one thing was certain. Luke's message wasn't just a cry for help, it was a warning. Jack trudged through the dense forest, the cold air biting at his exposed skin. Shadow moved steadily ahead, his nose low to the ground, pausing only occasionally to check the scents around him. The forest seemed eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of Jack's neck stand up. Every crunch of snow beneath his boots echoed louder than it should have, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As they moved deeper, Jack's mind wandered to the past, memories flooding in unbidden. He remembered Luke as the heart of their unit, always quick with a joke. Even in the darkest moments, Luke had a way of making everyone feel like they could survive anything, even when survival seemed impossible. But beneath that humor, Jack had always sensed something deeper, something Luke rarely let anyone see. The scorching heat was relentless, the kind that sucked the moisture from your skin and made your gear feel twice as heavy. Jack sat under the sparse shade of a weathered tarp, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision. Nearby, Luke was tossing a battered rubber ball to Shadow, the young Malinois darting back and forth with boundless energy. "You know," Luke said, grinning as Shadow returned the ball yet again, "if we could bottle this dog's energy, we'd be rich." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Pretty sure the army would just weaponize it." Luke laughed, but the sound was short-lived. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, where plumes of dust rose in the distance, a convoy making its way through the barren landscape. His smile faded, replaced by a look Jack had come to recognize, the weight of responsibility. Shadow trotted over, nudging Luke's leg with his nose. Luke knelt down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You know, buddy," he murmured, "you're the only one who doesn't ask for anything, just doing your job, day in and day out." Jack had watched the bond between them grow over the months. Shadow wasn't just a tool or a piece of equipment. He was a lifeline, a constant in the chaos of war. And Luke, he treated Shadow like an equal, trusting the dog more than he trusted most people. The flashback shifted, the memory bleeding into a night Jack wished he could forget. The convoy had come under fire as they moved through a narrow pass. Bullets ricocheted off the rocky walls, and the air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and shouted commands. Jack was pinned behind an overturned vehicle, his heart pounding as he tried to locate the source of the fire. "Shadow, seek!" Luke's voice cut through the chaos. The dog darted forward, low and fast, weaving through the smoke. Moments later, Shadow's bark rang out, sharp and insistent. Luke didn't hesitate, following the dog to a hidden alcove where the insurgents had set up their position. Within minutes, the tide had turned, the ambush was neutralized, and the convoy was able to move forward. Later that night, as they sat around a small fire, Luke had looked at Jack with a seriousness that was rare for him. "I owe that dog my life," he said quietly. "Hell, we all do." Jack snapped back to reality as Shadow stopped abruptly, his body tense. The dog let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on something ahead. Jack followed his gaze, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung over his shoulder. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered. Shadow began moving cautiously toward a cluster of rocks, his growl growing louder. Jack followed, his pulse quickening. As they approached, Jack noticed something out of place. A small pile of rocks carefully arranged to form a makeshift cairn. Resting on top was a folded piece of paper, weighted down by a smooth stone. Jack picked up the paper, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. The message inside was scrawled in the same shaky handwriting as the note he had found earlier. "I'm sorry. I tried to protect him, but the shadows are everywhere. If you're reading this, you know where to find me." Jack clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the paper. He knew what Luke meant by the shadows. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was the nightmares, the guilt, the memories that followed them home from war. And now, it seemed, those shadows had consumed Luke. Jack studied the area around the cairn, looking for any additional clues. There were footprints leading away from the rocks, heading deeper into the forest. They were faint, partially obscured by the snow, but they were fresh enough for Shadow to pick up the trail. "Good boy," Jack said, patting Shadow's head. The dog's tail wagged briefly before he resumed his focused stance. As they continued on, Jack couldn't shake the weight of the note in his pocket. He had seen too many friends lost to their own minds, and he wasn't about to let Luke become another name on that list. Shadow's presence was a reminder of the bond they had shared, of the trust and loyalty that had kept them alive in the past. But the forest grew darker, the trees closing in around them like silent sentinels. Jack's instincts told him they were getting closer to what? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that Luke was out here somewhere, and time was running out. The forest seemed to grow quieter as Jack and Shadow pressed on, the dense canopy blocking out the fading sunlight. The trail was uneven, dotted with patches of ice and snow that made each step treacherous. Shadow led the way with unwavering focus, his nose low to the ground and his ears twitching at every sound. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened. The note had been clear: Luke was somewhere out here, fighting battles Jack couldn't see. But the forest was vast, and the sense of urgency gnawed at Jack with every passing moment. After another mile, Shadow stopped abruptly, letting out a low bark. Jack followed the dog's gaze to a small clearing ahead. At the center stood a crude campsite, a worn-out tarp strung between two trees, a cold fire pit surrounded by rocks, and scattered belongings that told a story of desperation. Jack moved cautiously into the clearing, scanning the area for any signs of life. Shadow sniffed around, his movements deliberate and methodical. Jack's eyes landed on a small tin cup sitting on the ground near the fire pit. He picked it up, feeling the faint warmth still lingering on the metal. Luke was here, Jack muttered to himself. He crouched down, inspecting the ground. Footprints led away from the campsite, heading deeper into the forest. They were uneven, as if whoever had made them was stumbling. Shadow let out a soft whine, drawing Jack's attention to a nearby tree. Carved into the bark, barely visible in the dim light, were the words, "I'm sorry." Jack ran his fingers over the rough carving, his chest tightening. He could almost hear Luke's voice in his head, full of the weight he must have been carrying. The guilt, the regret, it was all there in those two simple words. As Jack prepared to follow the trail of footprints, Shadow's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. Jack froze, his senses on high alert. The forest around them felt different, charged, as if it were holding its breath. A faint rustling sound came from the trees to their left. Jack swung his rifle around, his finger hovering near the trigger. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, unshaven and disheveled, his eyes darting around nervously. He held up his hands as he stepped into the clearing. "Easy, man," the stranger said, his voice shaky. "I'm not looking for trouble." Jack kept his rifle trained on the man, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing out here?" "I was camping a little ways back," the man replied, his gaze flicking to Shadow. "Saw your dog and thought maybe you were the one leaving those notes." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "What notes?" The man shrugged, shifting uncomfortably under Jack's intense gaze. "Couple of days ago, I found one tied to a tree near my camp. It just said, 'The shadows are coming.' Creeped me out, so I packed up and started heading out. Ran into you instead." Jack lowered his rifle slightly, his mind racing. If Luke was leaving notes all over the forest, he wasn't just running, he was trying to send a message. But why? And to whom? "Did you see anyone else out here?" Jack asked. The man shook his head. "No one. Just heard things at night. Footsteps. Maybe. Hard to tell with the wind." Jack studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "Get out of here. This forest isn't safe." The man didn't need to be told twice. He disappeared into the trees, leaving Jack and Shadow alone once more. Jack knelt beside Shadow, scratching behind the dog's ears. "We've got to move fast, boy," he said. "Luke's leaving breadcrumbs, but we're running out of time." Shadow barked softly in response, his tail wagging faintly before he resumed tracking the trail. The footprints became harder to follow as the light faded, forcing Jack to rely on his flashlight. The beam illuminated broken branches and disturbed patches of snow, but there was no sign of Luke. As they moved deeper into the forest, the terrain grew steeper. Jack's breath came in short puffs, the cold air burning his lungs. Shadow slowed, his movements more deliberate, as if the trail was becoming harder to follow. Finally, they reached a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. Shadow stopped at the edge, his ears perked and his body tense. Jack scanned the valley below with his flashlight, but the dense undergrowth made it impossible to see far. "We're close," Jack murmured, feeling it in his gut. "I know we are." As they descended into the valley, Shadow suddenly stopped, his body rigid. He let out a series of sharp barks, his tail wagging furiously. Jack followed the dog's gaze, his flashlight landing on a faint glow in the distance. A fire. Jack's heart raced as he moved toward the light, his steps quick but cautious. Shadow stayed close, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The fire was small, barely more than a few embers glowing in the darkness, but it was enough to guide them. When they reached the source of the light, Jack's breath caught. Beside the dying fire sat a familiar figure, hunched over with his head in his hands. His clothes were tattered, his face gaunt, and his once bright eyes were clouded with exhaustion. "Luke," Jack said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The man looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. "Jack." Jack stepped closer, his heart pounding. "It's me, Luke. I found Shadow. He led me here." Luke's gaze shifted to the dog, and for the first time, a flicker of life returned to his eyes. "Shadow," he murmured, his voice cracking. The dog rushed forward, pressing his body against Luke's side, his tail wagging furiously. As Luke buried his face in Shadow's fur, Jack knelt beside him. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're not alone anymore." Luke's face was gaunt, his cheeks hollowed from exhaustion, but as Shadow pressed against him, a flicker of recognition softened his expression. He buried his hands into the dog's fur, gripping tightly as if anchoring himself to something real. His lips moved, barely forming words. Jack knelt down beside him, his voice steady but low. "It's okay, Luke," Jack said, his hand resting lightly on Luke's shoulder. "You're safe now." Luke looked up at him, his eyes glassy and distant. "Safe?" he repeated, his voice barely audible. "You don't know. The shadows. They're everywhere." Jack's heart clenched at the brokenness in Luke's voice. This wasn't the strong, confident leader he remembered from their days in Afghanistan. Luke looked like a man who had been running for far too long, his mind frayed by the memories he couldn't escape. "Luke, listen to me," Jack said firmly. "I found Shadow. He's okay. You're okay. We can figure this out together." But Luke shook his head violently, pulling away. "You don't understand," he snapped, his voice rising. "They're watching me. Every time I close my eyes, they're there. I thought if I got away, if I left everything behind, I could stop them, but it didn't work." Jack exchanged a glance with Shadow, whose ears perked at Luke's outburst. The dog nudged Luke gently, his tail wagging in an attempt to calm him. Luke's breathing slowed slightly, but the tension in his body remained. "Luke, there's no one else out here," Jack said, keeping his voice calm. "It's just me, you, and Shadow. Whatever you think is following you, it's not real." Luke's gaze darted around the clearing as if searching for unseen enemies. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, shoving it into Jack's hands. "Read it," he demanded. Jack unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the messy scrawl. "They're coming. I can feel it. I have to protect him. I can't let them take Shadow." "Too." Jack's stomach twisted as he read the words. It was clear that Luke's paranoia wasn't just a fleeting fear. It was consuming him, warping his perception of reality. The guilt and trauma from their time in the military had taken root, festering in the isolation of the forest. "Luke," Jack said gently, folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. "Nobody's coming for Shadow. He's safe with you, but you can't do this alone anymore. Let me help you." Luke stared at him, his jaw tightening. "Help me?" he repeated bitterly. "Where were you when I needed help before? When I came back and everything fell apart? You think you can just show up now and fix it?" The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He couldn't deny them. He had distanced himself after the war, retreating into his own solitude instead of reaching out. The weight of that failure pressed heavily on him, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't about him. "You're right," Jack admitted. "I should have been there. I should have stayed in touch. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving until I know you're okay." Shadow barked softly, drawing their attention. The dog sat patiently, his eyes locked on Luke as if urging him to listen. Luke's hands trembled as he reached out, stroking Shadow's fur. "They trained him to save lives," Luke said quietly, his voice cracking. "And now he's saving mine." Jack nodded, his throat tightening. "Yeah, he is. And you know what? He can't do it alone. He needs you, Luke, just like you need him." For a long moment, Luke said nothing. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the stillness of the forest. Finally, Luke looked up at Jack, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to come back from this," he whispered. "You don't have to do it all at once," Jack replied. "But the first step is letting someone help you. We'll figure out the rest together." Luke's shoulders sagged as the fight drained out of him. He nodded slowly, a fragile acceptance that carried the weight of his pain. Jack reached out, gripping his friend's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore, Luke," Jack said. "I promise." The journey back through the forest was slow and deliberate. Luke leaned heavily on Jack, his legs weak from days of malnourishment and exhaustion. Shadow walked close to Luke's side, his head held high, a silent protector. Jack kept a steady hand on Luke's arm, speaking to him in quiet tones. He shared stories of their time in the military, moments of camaraderie and laughter that seemed like a lifetime ago. Luke listened, occasionally nodding or offering a faint smile. As they neared the ridge, the lights of Jack's cabin came into view. Luke paused, his breath hitching. "What if I can't do this?" he asked. his voice barely more than a whisper. "You don't have to do it alone," Jack replied. "That's the difference this time." Luke glanced down at Shadow, who looked up at him with unwavering loyalty. The dog's tail wagged, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Luke allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. When they reached the cabin, Jack helped Luke inside, settling him into a chair near the fire. Shadow lay at Luke's feet, his eyes never leaving his handler. Jack handed Luke a warm cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "This is just the start," Jack said. "Tomorrow, we'll call the VA. There are people who can help, people who've been through this, just like you." Luke stared into the fire, his hands cradling the cup. "You really think they can help?" Jack leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I know they can, but more than that, I know Shadow and I will be here every step of the way." Luke's gaze softened as he looked at Jack, then down at Shadow. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. The morning light filtered through the curtains of Jack's cabin, casting a warm glow over the small living room. Luke sat in a worn armchair near the fireplace, a blanket draped over his shoulders. Shadow lay at his feet, his ears twitching as he dreamed. The dog had hardly left Luke's side since they returned the night before. Jack entered the room carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He set one on the table beside Luke and sat in the chair opposite him. The silence between them was comfortable but heavy, each man lost in his own thoughts. "Sleep okay?" Jack asked. Breaking the quiet, Luke nodded hesitantly. "Better than I have in months," he admitted. His voice was hoarse, but there was a faint steadiness to it that hadn't been there the night before. Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I called the VA this morning," he said. "They've got a center about an hour from here, specialize in PTSD and animal-assisted therapy. They've worked with guys like us before." Luke's grip tightened on the coffee mug, his jaw clenching. "What if it doesn't work?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the floor. Jack didn't hesitate. "Then we try something else," he said firmly. "But you've got to give it a shot. For yourself. For Shadow." Luke glanced down at the dog, who had woken and was now watching him intently. Shadow's tail wagged slowly, as if he understood the weight of the moment. "All right," Luke said quietly. "I'll go." Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good. We'll head over after breakfast." The drive to the VA center was quiet but not uncomfortable. Luke stared out the window as the scenery passed, his mind clearly elsewhere. Shadow sat in the back seat, occasionally nudging Luke's shoulder with his nose as if to reassure him. Jack glanced at Luke. "You're doing the right thing," he said. Luke didn't respond immediately. After a long pause, he said, "It's just hard to admit I need help. Feels like I'm failing somehow." Jack gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Asking for help doesn't make you weak, Luke. It makes you smart. It means you're strong enough to fight for yourself." Luke nodded slowly, his fingers drumming on the door. "I guess I never learned how to do that." The VA center was a modest building nestled at the edge of a wooded area. It had a calm, inviting air, with a small garden at the entrance and staff who greeted them with warm smiles. A counselor named Dr. Harris met them in the lobby. She was in her late 40s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Luke, Jack," she said, her tone professional but gentle. "It's good to meet you both." Luke hesitated, his hand hovering over Shadow's head. "Can Shadow stay with me?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Dr. Harris smiled. "Of course. We've found that dogs like Shadow can be a big part of the healing process." Shadow seemed to sense Luke's apprehension, pressing closer to his side. Luke exhaled shakily, giving a small nod. "All right, let's do this." Dr. Harris led them to a private room where Luke could talk freely. Jack stayed in the waiting area, letting Luke take this step on his own. Shadow accompanied Luke into the session, sitting obediently by his side. Inside, Luke found it difficult at first to put his thoughts into words. The memories felt tangled, too heavy to unravel. But as he spoke, The counselor's calm demeanor and Shadow's unwavering presence began to ease the tension in his chest. "They trained us to be strong," Luke said after a long pause. "But they didn't tell us what to do when the war followed us home." Dr. Harris nodded empathetically. "That's a common experience for many veterans. The important thing is recognizing that you don't have to face it alone. Healing takes time, but you've already taken the hardest step by being here." Luke glanced at Shadow, who was resting his head on Luke's knee. The dog's presence grounded him, reminding him that even in his darkest moments, he wasn't alone. Over the next few days, Luke began to settle into the program. Shadow played a vital role in his therapy, participating in exercises designed to rebuild trust and confidence. Whether it was walking through the wooded trails around the center or sitting quietly during group discussions, Shadow was always by Luke's side. Jack visited regularly, bringing familiar comforts like Luke's favorite coffee and stories from their shared past. He watched as Luke began to reconnect with the man he had once been. Piece by piece, one afternoon, during a quiet moment in the garden, Luke turned to Jack. "I don't think I'd be here without Shadow," he said. "He's been my lifeline." Jack smiled. "Yeah, well, he's not the only one who's got your back." As the weeks went by, Luke began to open up more during his sessions. He shared stories of the war, the guilt he carried, and the fear that had driven him into isolation. With each session, the weight on his shoulders seemed to lighten, if only a little. Dr. Harris introduced him to other veterans in the program, men and women who had faced similar struggles. Through their shared experiences, Luke found a sense of camaraderie he hadn't felt in years. Shadow continued to thrive in his role, sensing Luke's emotions and providing silent support. The dog's loyalty and patience became a source of strength, helping Luke navigate the difficult path of recovery. One evening, as Luke sat with Jack and Shadow under the stars, he spoke with a clarity that had been absent for so long. "I know I'm not there yet," he said, "but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm heading in the right direction." Jack raised his mug of coffee in a silent toast. "That's all anyone can ask for." Luke smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. The dog looked up at him, his tail wagging gently. "Thanks for not giving up on me," Luke said softly. "Never crossed my mind." Jack replied. The crisp autumn air rustled through the trees as Luke stood at the edge of a clearing near the VA center. Shadow sat beside him, his posture alert but relaxed. It had been 2 months since Luke first arrived at the facility, and while the road to recovery was far from over, he felt a strength returning that he hadn't known in years. Jack leaned against the hood of his truck nearby, watching Luke with a mixture of pride and relief. He had seen his friend transform from a man consumed by guilt and fear into someone willing to face the battles within. Luke had found a sense of purpose during his time at the center. He volunteered to help with the facility's therapy dog program, training other veterans to work with animals like Shadow. It was a role that felt natural to him, combining his military training with his growing desire to help others. "This feels right," Luke admitted to Jack one afternoon as they walked through the center's wooded trails. "Working with the dogs, helping other vets. It's like I finally have something to give back." Jack nodded. "You always had it in you, Luke. You just needed the chance to find it again." Luke glanced at Shadow, who trotted ahead, his tail wagging. "I owe it to him, too. Shadow never gave up on me. Neither did you." Shadow's transformation was as remarkable as Luke's. No longer the undernourished, anxious dog Jack had found tied to a tree, Shadow now exuded confidence and calm. His role as Luke's therapy dog expanded into assisting other veterans during group sessions, providing comfort and reassurance. Dr. Harris often commented on Shadow's impact. "He has a gift," she said during one session. "He knows how to meet people where they are, just like he did with you, Luke." Shadow's presence became a beacon of hope for the veterans at the center. His steady, unwavering loyalty reminded them that healing was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. One day, Dr. Harris approached Luke with an idea. "We're hosting a seminar for new veterans next month," she said. "We'd like you to share your story, how you and Shadow found each other, and how that connection brought you here." The idea made Luke uneasy. Public speaking wasn't something he had ever felt comfortable with, and the thought of sharing his most vulnerable moments with strangers was daunting. "I don't know if I can do that," he told Jack later that evening. "What if they don't get it?" Jack's response was firm but gentle. "Luke, your story could save someone else. You know what it's like to feel lost. If sharing what you've been through can help just one person, isn't it worth it?" Luke looked down at Shadow, who gazed up at him with trusting eyes. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "I guess it is." The day of the seminar arrived, and the auditorium was filled with veterans, their families, and staff from the VA. Luke stood backstage, his hands clenched at his sides. Shadow sat at his feet, sensing his nerves. The dog nudged Luke's hand with his nose, breaking the tension. "You're right," Luke said, smiling down at Shadow. "I've got this." When Luke stepped onto the stage, the audience fell silent. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Jack, who sat near the front. Jack gave him a small nod of encouragement. "My name is Luke Morgan," he began, his voice steady. "I'm a veteran, and for a long time, I thought my story was over. But thanks to this dog, and a friend who refused to give up on me, I'm here to tell you it's never too late to find your way back." Luke shared the story of his struggles after returning from the military, his descent into isolation, and the moment Shadow became his lifeline. He spoke of the guilt, the fear, and the shame that had held him captive, and how asking for help was the hardest and bravest thing he had ever done. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Then, one by one, the audience stood, their applause filling the air. Luke looked down at Shadow, who wagged his tail, and then over to Jack, who wore a proud smile. After the seminar, veterans approached Luke to share their own stories. Some spoke of similar struggles, while others expressed gratitude for his courage in speaking out. Luke realized he wasn't alone, and he never had been. The seminar sparked a new sense of purpose in Luke. He began working with the VA to develop programs that combined therapy dogs with veteran support. His journey became a catalyst for change, not just for himself but for others who had felt the same darkness. One evening, Luke, Jack, and Shadow sat around a fire pit outside the cabin. The sky above was a canvas of stars, and the air was filled with the faint crackle of burning wood. Shadow lay between them, his head resting on Luke's boot. "You've come a long way," Jack said, his voice soft. Luke nodded, staring into the fire. "I'm not the same man I was a year ago," he said, "but I think I'm finally starting to like the man I'm becoming." Jack raised his coffee mug in a silent toast. "To that man," he said. Shadow's tail thumped against the ground, and Luke laughed, a sound that had once been so rare but now felt natural. Luke's journey wasn't over, but it had transformed into something greater than himself. He and Shadow had become a symbol of resilience, proving that even the deepest scars could heal with time, trust, and the right support. As the fire burned low, Luke reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. "We've still got work to do, buddy," he said, "but I think we're ready for it." Shadow's ears perked, and his tail wagged in agreement. Together, they looked out into the night, the darkness no longer something to fear but a reminder of how far they had come. The sun rose over the Appalachian hills, casting golden light across the VA Center's sprawling grounds. Luke, now standing taller and more self-assured, adjusted the collar of his jacket as he watched Shadow sprint across the training field. The dog's sleek coat gleamed in the sunlight, and his movements were full of energy and purpose, a stark contrast to the frail, trembling animal Jack had found months ago. Nearby, Jack leaned against the fence, sipping a steaming cup of coffee. He had become a regular visitor at the center, not just to support Luke, but also to lend his own experiences to the community of veterans finding their way back. It had been a year since the night in the forest when Jack and Shadow found Luke at his lowest point. Since then, Luke had not only rebuilt his life but had also become a source of inspiration for others. His work with therapy dogs had evolved into a full-time role at the VA, where he led workshops for veterans learning to work with service animals. Shadow had also become a central figure at the center, helping other veterans navigate their recovery. The dog's calm, steady presence had a way of breaking through the barriers many of them had built around themselves. Luke walked over to Jack, his steps confident and unhurried. "Coffee still the highlight of your day?" he teased, nodding toward Jack's mug. Jack smirked. "It's a close second to seeing you out here, actually looking like you belong in the world again." Luke chuckled, shaking his head. "Didn't think I'd get here, to be honest. But you and Shadow, you didn't let me fall." Luke's journey had not only been about personal healing but also about creating a ripple effect. The veterans who attended his workshops often commented on how seeing Luke and Shadow's bond gave them hope. Luke's honesty about his struggles broke down barriers, and his willingness to share his story inspired others to confront their own demons. One afternoon, during a group session, a young veteran approached Luke after the meeting. "I didn't think anyone would get it," he said, his voice hesitant. "But hearing you talk about Shadow and how he brought you back, it makes me think maybe I can find something like that too." Luke placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "You can," he said, "and you don't have to do it alone." Shadow's transformation into a certified therapy dog was another point of pride for Luke. The dog's natural intelligence and calm demeanor made him an invaluable part of the VA's program. Shadow accompanied Luke to seminars, participated in one-on-one sessions with veterans, and even helped train other service dogs. "He's not just my partner," Luke said during one of his talks. "He's a reminder that even when you feel lost, there's always a way back." The audience often responded with standing ovations, moved by the bond between Luke and Shadow and the story of how they saved each other. One cold winter evening, Jack and Luke sat by a fire outside the cabin, the stars twinkling above. Shadow lay curled up between them, his eyes half closed but his ears still alert. Jack stared into the fire, his face thoughtful. "You've done good, Luke," Jack said finally. "But I've got to ask, what's next for you?" Luke poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the air. "Honestly, I don't know if there's a finish line to all this," he admitted. "But I do know I want to keep helping. There are so many people out there who feel like I did, like the fight is over, like there's no point. If I can show even one of them that there's a way forward, it'll be worth it." Jack smiled, raising his mug. "To the fight that never ends." Luke laughed, clinking his mug against Jack's. "And to the people who fight beside us." The next morning, Luke stood in front of a small group of veterans and their families, preparing to share his story once again. Shadow sat by his side, his head held high, a picture of resilience and loyalty. As Luke began to speak, Jack watched from the back of the room, his chest swelling with pride. Luke's words carried weight, not just because of his experiences but because of the honesty with which he shared them. He didn't shy away from the darkness, but he always ended with a message of hope. "Shadow didn't just lead me out of the forest that night," Luke said, his voice steady. "He led me back to myself. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you don't have to fight alone. There's always someone or something willing to help you carry the weight." The room erupted into applause as Luke finished, and Shadow barked once, as if to punctuate the moment. Luke knelt down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Good boy," he whispered. "We've got more work to do, don't we?" Shadow wagged his tail, his eyes full of unwavering trust. Together, they had faced the shadows, and together, they would continue to bring light to others. As the sun set on the Appalachian hills that evening, Luke, Jack, and Shadow walked along the same trail where Jack had first found the dog. The forest no longer felt like a place of fear or isolation. It was a reminder of how far they had come. Luke paused at the old tree where Shadow had once been tied, running his hand over the rough bark. "This is where it all started," he said softly. Jack nodded. "And look how far you've come." Luke smiled, his hand resting on Shadow's head. "Yeah," he said, "but we're just getting started." As they walked back toward the cabin, the stars began to appear one by one, lighting the path ahead. Shadow trotted between them, his tail wagging, as if to say that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together.